Hello! Today I'm taking a look at Square Enix's next generation flagship title for the PlayStation 5, Final Fantasy XVI. Now, during its build-up, Final Fantasy XVI has been teased as something of a reset button for the series, which, to be honest, isn't anything new because each mainline game has been pushed as something of a refresh for the series ever since about Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy XII, but the game being helmed by Yoshi-P in particular and Creative Business Unit 3, which had up until this point focused specifically on the MMO games, and Yoshi-P's quite candid interviews in the build-up and promotion of Final Fantasy XVI, where he's obviously been quite uncompromising in his vision for the project, it really did make this game feel like it would be something quite different. And indeed, since its release and having played it, in so many ways it has proved different, and at face value at least, if one were to see the mechanics of the game on paper, it might sound very removed from our idea of what Final Fantasy is, particularly those who were around for the PlayStation 1 era and the titles there, that in so many ways I think set the bar and established the expectations for what Final Fantasy games should be. But despite how different it is, at least at face value, what I'll explore over the course of this episode is how, in my opinion, it is curiously the most Final Fantasy game that we've seen in decades, despite being deprived of, or at least changing up, a lot of the factors that we think makes Final Fantasy, and the traditional game elements that the anthology tends to have. And of course, this has not come without its criticisms, and I did expect the sort of reactions that we have seen so far, which is a large number of fans who have been won over by the game and they really enjoy it, and a slightly kind of lesser number either not being overly impressed with the game, and a lesser number still kind of outrightly disliking it. And I put a poll on the community page quite recently, which at the time of recording is about a 70-30 split between those who love it and those who aren't overly bothered by it, which I think is a pretty even spread, a pretty representative spread of what I've seen of opinions elsewhere. So moving on, and just before we jump into discussing the game proper, it's prudent to mention I'll be discussing gameplay, setting, story, and characters here with increasing amounts of spoilers disclosed. So if you are currently playing the game or intending to play the game, you might want to give this a miss, at least for now. Though I will flag when I'm going kind of really deep into story spoiler territory later on. And as I have done with other Final Fantasy episodes in recent years, I want to summarise kind of story and characters here, but I will go on to sort of break them down into character-specific episodes in the coming weeks, rather than cram everything in here, as this is more of a kind of generalised review of the game. And I think characters like Clive, Jill, Dion, Cid, so many of them really kind of warrant their own dedicated discussions and episodes, I think. So with that aside, let's get into the game now, and where I often start with art direction and setting to sort of lead us into the central events, I'm really keen here to focus on gameplay, because as already touched upon, I was expecting it to be divorced from earlier popular titles like 7, 8, 9, 10 in favour of something more action-centric. But nonetheless, despite the radically different approach to gameplay, I was amazed by how it felt, at least to my mind, as quintessentially Final Fantasy as those earlier games. And I've actually re-evaluated what I think makes Final Fantasy a Final Fantasy, owing to how Square completely changed things up here, yet still retained or returned to the essence of what these games generally use as game elements and mechanics, and what they really are. And actually, it is the first time in years that I've been so into a game that I've sat and played through in 5, 6, 7 hour intervals, waking up at 5:30 a.m. to play a little bit before I start my day and that sort of thing, just to keep experiencing the world and story. And it's not a feeling I've really had or can recall having since, those halcyon days of playing Final Fantasy. So it really was a return to form in my own mind. But in keeping with gameplay and how it was kind of the same but different approach, let's look at some of the more contentious examples here, starting with the party system. Now, In the run-up to Final Fantasy XVI's release, there was a lot of back and forth about whether or not this was a single character game experience from a single character perspective, or a more ensemble adventure. And I do think this is crucial to consider, and I have stated in the past that I think a cornerstone of Final Fantasy is this notion of a fellowship quest, which dates all the way back to the Warriors of Light in the first game, wherein we have different characters, often with different backgrounds, agendas, personalities, coming together towards a common goal. And this is a convention that's found throughout fantasy genre media in general, notable examples being Tolkien with The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings novels. And the means of delivering this in Final Fantasy has more often than not always been a party-based combat system, which employs a range of different character classes, monks, mages, summoners, and so on, to strategize and utilize with their unique abilities and personalities in combat, which helps include them in the story and the player experience. But instead of this, Final Fantasy XVI opted to craft most of the game experience around the playability of Clive, to a lesser extent the command settings of his companion dog, Torgal, and then he's assisted by AI-driven party members who come and go throughout the central storyline, much like guest characters who proliferated games like Final Fantasy II. And as I say, on paper this sounds very removed from a familiar Final Fantasy experience, where we would traditionally expect to command our party in battle and have this core, consistent group of characters to venture through the story with. And to be honest, when I started the game, this point, along with some of these other gameplay elements I'm going to mention, it did raise an eyebrow for me, and I was like, oh, is this going to be really terrible? But as the game went on, it quite quickly changed my perspective on what it is that makes Final Fantasy games succeed as an ensemble fellowship quest, and being able to command the party doesn't necessarily equate to that at all. For example, let's look at the other party member touchpoints that occur in Final Fantasy games beyond merely the combat scenarios. So we often have side quests that delve into the histories and stories of our supporting characters. We often have short periods of controlling other party members for short periods of time. Final Fantasy IX, classic example. And I think most importantly, at least in my opinion, for crafting a sense of fellowship, is that away from the dramatic action and the combat and the dungeon crawls, we have these moments of respite where we can converse with our comrades. We gain insight into events and insight into their personalities and their plights. And Final Fantasy XVI has a wealth of these sorts of scenarios, more often with the guest characters in the party, but also sporadically throughout the world, and the various towns and villages we encounter as the world map builds out and we meet more characters. So we have this network of secondary supporting cast members that really builds our sense of the world, a sense of personal stories, obstacles and agendas, and indeed a sense of our protagonist Clive, whose personality is built up and reflected back by those that he interacts with. So actually, irrespective of our party being AI controlled, I had a really increasingly nostalgic Final Fantasy sort of feeling with the character interactions as well, that built up towards the end game, particularly when we arrive at Waloed and beyond, where there is this very kind of coming together and self-aware sense of Final Fantasy reflected in this party. In similar fashion, we have the side quests, and on this note, I was quite surprised to see a few reviews and a few commentators criticising the side quests in this game as dull and repetitive fetch quests. And personally, I disagree with that, because looking to other games with side quests like Elder Scrolls or Assassin's Creed, you quite often find that they have a running formula of, yes, fetching something, killing something in order to try and level up or get money, because in many respects, that is what side quests sort of do. They service that sort of game experience and that leveling. But personally, while Final Fantasy XVI does to some extent rely on that sort of formula, I absolutely loved that maybe 70-75% of the side quests that I've done in this game directly contribute to world building. They contribute to a secondary character's or a party member's story arc, or indeed Clive's story arc. And also, of course, they result in cool rewards, whether that's a chocobo, whether that's a weapon, whatever it might be. And I can't think of any other game where a seemingly random side quest from a random character can so often spin out into a fully fleshed out cutscene that really adds something to the world experience, the lore and the setting, or the relationship between two characters, or in fact a game where an optional side quest can give us such a valuable bonus as a mode of transport, so a chocobo to ride, or a permanent party member to have alongside us. So I really enjoy these for the most part, and I think they really contribute to the overall game experience and our understanding of Final Fantasy XVI as a game and a world. And indeed, some of the side quests, such as there's one called The Bearer of Good News in Dalmatia, and a handful of others like this, they simply have us going around being nice to people. There's no monsters to slay, there's no items to fetch, it's just Clive going around giving people good news, which I think really highlights a key theme of the game, and I'll touch on this more shortly, but also it shows how rewarding exposition can be gained without necessarily having to kill anything or do any of these sort of formulaic side quest things. So I accept that some people don't enjoy side quests, they don't enjoy fetch quests specifically, which is fine, and I get it, and a lot of the times I can't be bothered with them either, but personally I found Final Fantasy XVI did go a long way to make them a rewarding aspect of play. So, moving on, but in keeping with gameplay, we have the combat system, and more specifically the employment of summons in this game. And once again, I did enjoy how they changed this up, because while familiar deities such as Phoenix, Ifrit and Shiva are able to be acquired and utilised in this game, it's not in the familiar sense that we can summon the being into battle for an attack cutscene or prolonged assistance, but rather, in keeping with the specific lore of Final Fantasy XVI, we channel aspects of these beings' power into Clive's own attacks and personal abilities, which very much plays into the more action-centric approach of this particular Final Fantasy game. Now, I'm not going to labour on the action-based combat here, because since Final Fantasy XV, I think it's been a clear direction for the series, and I did expect it. But what I will say is that owing to the quite complex array of abilities and things we can do in battle, whether that's commanding toggle, toggling summon abilities, limit breaks, and so on, I think the controller mapping was another factor that prevented any real attempt at making the party playable, along with the fact that so many characters come and go throughout the quest as guests, because we've seen Final Fantasy VII Remake implement action-based gameplay beautifully in terms of a party-based combat system. And I think that owed to the comparatively straightforward controller arrangement, the traditional command menu on the screen and that sort of thing, which by its nature Final Fantasy XVI couldn't really achieve. But again, I think 16's approach to combat, while it was unconventional, along with its use of summons, it was an excellent way to sort of reapproach how summons are utilised in story and setting for this particular game. Now, a familiar note on familiar but different gameplay before we delve more into the story and the characters here is the world map. And since about Final Fantasy X, the world map has been a contentious and ever-evolving facet of the Final Fantasy experience. Because as technology improves, as explorability and scale becomes more of an expectation and weirdly associated with a game being good by some commentators, Square has continued to evolve how this works from linear flows like Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy VII Remake, to large open world sprawls like Final Fantasy XII, Final Fantasy XV. And personally, I've always felt that there is a balance to be had. I've noted several times when discussing Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy XV, and extensively in my old What is Final Fantasy episode, that Final Fantasy is at its best, in my opinion, when it crafts an illusion of scope without being either too linear or too open world. Because with the former, you feel like you are too constrained and like you're running down an endless corridor towards an end game or a goal. And in the latter, you can oftentimes traverse a large expanse of nothing for the sake of having a large world map. So I always loved the minified world maps of the games up until Final Fantasy IX, but what we see in Final Fantasy XVI is a hybridized world map experience, where we begin essentially with a fast travel sort of UI map that drops us into specific linear story scenarios. And this was another thing that scared me at the beginning of the game. But as we progress, this opens out into a large accessible sprawl of entire regions and townships that we can either fast travel to or we can explore at our leisure. And I like this, and I think it strikes that balance pretty well, and it retains that sense of Final Fantasy explorability, with I suppose the only omission being the historic progression of acquirable transport from chocobo to boat to airship. But again, this particular Final Fantasy experience, this particular world, didn't necessarily warrant that. And I liked to have the balance between the explorability with efficiency, because barring a few games like maybe Skyrim, Ghost of Tsushima, and a few others, I do think it's quite hard to achieve and justify an extensive world that you have to traverse in real time. So that's some key examples of gameplay and how I think they adapted, but weirdly also retained a sense of Final Fantasy within them. And for my part, I think they allowed for a good amount of strategy, exploration, and exposition in these new and novel means of delivery. But moving on, let's look now at setting, world, story, and some of the themes there. And what we have here is something that early on was speculated as something akin to the team's previous titles of Final Fantasy XIV, or indeed the Evilist games like Tactics or 12. And I can see the reasoning for that, because Final Fantasy XVI is clearly a return to the sort of North European inflected medieval style knights and mages fantasy that we see in these sorts of games. And indeed, in the earliest games, such as Final Fantasies 1 and 2, which really kicked off with this sort of westernized vibe. And rather than the overtly science fantasy games of the mid to late 90s, which were a fusion of the archaic and the technologically advanced, whether that's the futurism of Final Fantasy VIII or the steampunk and retro-futurism of Final Fantasy IX, the world of Valencia is a more rudimentary sort of setting with stone castles and empires and duchies, sword and shield battles and that sort of stuff. But within this, there was one thing that I did really like, which was this seemingly antiquated setting in its own way was a post-apocalyptic setting as well, where there's evidence of an ancient, much more technologically advanced race that's been wiped off the face of the earth. And this draws comparisons, I think, with Final Fantasy X and the Machina-wielding ancients there, the Elder Scrolls series, which had the advanced Dwemer races. We explore the sort of dungeons that show their old technology, and sporadic bits of fiction like Terry Brooks' Shannara novels, which were all about elves and magic, but they were set on a post-apocalyptic planet Earth, so they were pretty interesting as well. And in this way, Final Fantasy XVI introduced two common conventions of the series, which is an ancient race who inhabited the world before us, known as the Fallen in this game, and also a nod towards airship technology. So rather than featuring accessible playable airships in the game, we can see the decaying remnants of these ancient airships that populate and indeed comprise the topography of the world, which was really quite cool. Another element of the world and setting is that, along with the recurring set pieces such as crystals and chocobos and airships, is its frequently remarked upon Game of Thrones sort of vibe, and it's generally much darker in tone for a Final Fantasy, which seeps into story and character, and rather than early Final Fantasy titles, which generally had quite clear-cut good versus bad divides, Valencia introduces a world riven by conflict, grey characters, and disparate civilizations and social hierarchies, from the Roman Empire-esque Sambrec and the isolationist kingdom of Waloed to the Duchy of Rosaria and the Iron Kingdoms beyond that. And all of this embodies the same murky, morally dubious characterization that we see in Westeros in the Game of Thrones saga, and parallels might reasonably be drawn between the ruthless seafaring Iron Kingdom of Valencia with the Ironborn Islanders of Westeros. The wealthy Sambrecs may be compared to the Casterly Rock Lannisters, and the noble to a fault Rosalians with the Starks of Winterfell On top of this, we have the element of magic introduced as a scarce resource in both of these settings, along with the almost zombie-like antagonists of the Akashic in 16 and the White Walkers of Westeros, who are thralls who are allegiant to an ambiguous greater evil. So there's a lot of similarity here, not to mention the liberal use of bloodletting, swearing, and slightly more adult-orientated interactions. But I would stress that Final Fantasy XVI, despite these familiar set pieces, does stand unique from Game of Thrones. It definitely feels like its own world and setting, and it feels much more like a Final Fantasy, with the use of crystals and summons being a huge part of the world and the narrative backbone of the title. Indeed, I would go so far as to suggest that Final Fantasy XVI is a self-aware celebration and reference back to the Final Fantasy anthology itself in a lot of ways, with callbacks to earlier titles made in cameos and comedic reprieves, with everything from Black Mage Scarecrows looking like Vivi from Final Fantasy IX, Dragoons posing like Kain from Final Fantasy IV, and a broad array of battle moves and musical scores that call back to elements of earlier games. But more so than that, and shifting more into story now, looking broadly at the overall structure and meta, we see what I think is a very self-aware, almost tongue-in-cheek nod to the series conventions in its grander arc. Dipping a bit more into spoilers now, because beyond the warring nations and the Game of Thrones sort of elements, we have a hero whose arc builds around themes of existentialism towards a final showdown with a malevolent god character. And where this is indeed something that we find in most Final Fantasies, such as Kefka and Sephiroth aspiring and metamorphosizing into a godlike final form, and Cecil, Cloud, Squall, Zidane, all these other heroes who battle with some existential dilemma about their place in the world and who they are, Final Fantasy XVI does away with any pretense or metaphor or allegory around this sort of stuff and around these themes, and it literally has a creator god as an antagonist and Clive, the protagonist, sort of discussing consciousness and logos and pretty much Frankel's theory of meaning in their interactions with one another, to the extent that their dialogues kind of read like a philosophy textbook. And honestly, I sort of love that. It perfectly played up to the fact that endgame villains in Final Fantasy are completely mad and they have these mad agendas, and the hero's crisis of self almost always resolves in killing some pseudo-god character, which in this instance they've cannily exchanged for an actual god rather than a metaphor for one. So I thought that was brilliant. But while I do believe that Final Fantasy XVI was purposefully sort of self-aware and grimly tongue-in-cheek in some of these instances, I would stress that it didn't make it feel like the game was being cynical or unserious. And quite to the contrary, I think it had some of the most beautifully written and poignant scenes that I've seen in a Final Fantasy game, or kind of any game, really. Testament there to the localization, because some of the writing was absolutely fantastic in these emotional moments. And I'm not particularly overly sentimental as an individual, but there were several times that the game tugged on the heartstrings with its unflinching depictions of love, loss, regret, redemption, and indeed revenge. And this gets right to the heart of Final Fantasy XVI's story, I think. Its overriding themes, which I think personally hinge around not just what it means to live, but what it means to live well in a chaotic and uncaring world. So, from the outset of the story, following the epic foreshadowing of the Icon battle and the war-torn conflicts of Valencia, which sort of throw us into the action and set up the game events and the character conflicts, we quickly see a young Clive suffer the slings and arrows of human experience as he loses his father, his brother, and his social standing in the world to his mother's betrayal. And while I'll explore this later in a dedicated episode, the significance of Clive having a, quote marks, nuclear family in the beginning of the story, which is quite uncommon for a fantasy hero and a Final Fantasy hero, is the fact that they are torn away from him quite quickly. And so the trauma of losing a father, of failing to protect a brother, and being betrayed by an uncaring mother is the impetus for his personal dilemma and his character arc that dogs him throughout the story. And I think it's one that echoes out and reflects wider events and wider character arcs, whether it's Jill, whether it's Gav, Otto, whoever, because so many characters in this game have been scarred by their experiences of the world, and they've all lost something. And indeed, they become quite despondent because of that. And this is a great theme for Final Fantasy XVI, I think, because it keeps close to the existential themes that hallmarked the celebrated earlier games, but it also operates in a very human and relatable sort of set of scenarios that create these sort of poignant moments. And actually, in the build-up to this game, there was a lot of anticipation and discussion around the time jumps, because of course we see young Clive, we see older Clive in his 20s, and then we see adult Clive. And I think this sort of structure for the game, these sets of time jumps, it really plays subtly into the existential dilemma and the sense of human suffering in this game, because time by its nature, as a dimension, is a measure and a reminder of life's finiteness. And I'm sure I wasn't the only one who looked at moments like that time jump between young Clive being press-ganged into the military, and then later adult Clive finally escaping the military. And I just thought to myself, what a horrible waste of his youth, all of those years being press-ganged into this horrible sort of set of conflicts. And likewise, the constant close shaves of him almost encountering Joshua as an adult, almost kind of reconciling with him after thinking him dead for so long. The wasted years between these two brothers not having seen one another. These were just great moments that exemplified that rather harrowing aspect of time in relation to human experience. And I think this is a good time to mention Cid, actually, because the thematic antidote to that, and the salvation and the turning point in Clive's character arc and his journey, is undoubtedly this game's rendition of the famous Cid character, who, unlike in former titles, where Cid is a fringe supporting cast member or a supporting villain, Cid Telamon in Final Fantasy XVI is probably the most pivotal character to the central story, and in particular Clive's story that we encounter. His role, structurally, thematically, and narratively, can't be understated, because he is at once this embodiment of the archetypal mentor figure that guides Clive in archetypal fashion. He's the first genuinely good-natured individual that Clive seems to meet as an adult, who liberates him from conscription and guides him in his education of the Warring Kingdoms, the Mother Crystals, the Dominants, and this sort of stuff. But chiefly, he also invigorates Clive and others with a new and more aspirational vision of the world, with a key dialogue being about living rather than simply surviving, and that sort of thing, which is a sentiment that actually Clive inherits from Cid, along with his title. And he seems to become the ray of hope that Cid was for him, helping others, liberating enslaved bearers, vanquishing tyrants, and so on, which I think was an excellent trajectory for the story to take, and it plays up to that tagline, fate will fall. So I like that, and the way they communicated this sentiment in subtle and not so subtle ways throughout the game. For example, the fact that we have a base of operations known as the Hideaway isn't something that we often see in Final Fantasy, and probably the closest comparison I can think of is Balam Garden in the early stages of Final Fantasy VIII, because where most games have this ongoing adventure and fellowship quest from point A to point B to point C, Final Fantasy XVI's story becomes a story of salvaging lost souls and forging a new hope and a new civilization from the ashes of these falling empires and their respective mother crystals, not to mention saving it from the malevolent god Ultima, who has been corrupting these kingdoms and seeking to do away with humanity to secure its own survival. And so, relating back to these side quests, where we are sometimes merely helping people and being nice to people, I think it really reflects this theme of living life well that I allude to here. So, that's the broad strokes of what I think are the key trajectory aspects of the story. But as always, with Final Fantasy, the real heart of this, and what brings it to life, is the interactions, the dialogues, and the comrades that we meet along the way. And looking at the characters in summary, we have, of course, the aforementioned Cid. We have Clive, who I think is an excellent hero, who balances this aspirational worldview with a definite ruthlessness towards his enemies. And actually, in the build-up to Final Fantasy XVI, I thought this was going to be much more of a sort of revenge tale, because we saw these glimpses of an angry-looking Clive, and it hinted at something of an unforgiving anti-hero. But while it does flirt with that, and Clive's anger at losing his brother, his ongoing vendetta with Hugo, and so on, I think thanks to the influence of Cid, and later of Jill, who's a very key character for him, he becomes much more of a measured, positive, and amicable figure as the story goes on. He has affections for his comrades like Gav. He has profound empathy for the victimised bearers and citizens of Valisthea, and he has his overt romance with Jill, and of course his loyal companionship with Torgal. Beyond this, he also has his inner contention and gradual acceptance of his own latent powers, which is being the dominant of the temperamental force Ifrit, and so all of this comes together and paints a very three-dimensional hero, and it reaches into key aspects of the broader story as the son of a displaced dukedom, so a remnant of the old world, the fated mythos of the icons, which makes him directly related and needed by Ultima, and all of this sort of stuff. I thought Clive was fantastic and well realised. Turning to the supporting cast, we have Joshua, Jill and Gav, who I would argue are the main three to sort of orbit Clive, followed by Uncle Byron, Dion, and other peripheral characters we meet, such as Mid. And each of these develop Clive in a very mutualistic way, because as they evolve Clive, they themselves are developed too. And whether it's Uncle Byron's heartfelt speech about his survivor's guilt, which I really enjoyed, that was a great moment of the game. Gav's selflessness in throwing himself behind enemy lines to help his friends, which is often remarked upon, and we discover more about him and his intentions there in Sidequests. And Jill, who in many respects mirrors Clive in her thirst for revenge, against the Islands. But likewise with Clive, she finds solace in his company, as he does with her. So really great mutualistic, as I say, sort of group of characters who bring to life the world and story, but also bring to life and make one another more three-dimensional through their interactions. And I do think that Dion and Vivian actually deserve a shout-out, because firstly, Dion, while on the Venn diagram of narrative, he is very much orbiting in this secondary storyline that's particular to him, and it primarily serves to show how Ultima is corrupting and affecting these different kingdoms. The way that it resolves and overlaps climactically with Clive and Joshua was just brilliantly written, and I think Dion's kind of micro-arc within the game, I suppose, was so well written, reminding me very much of Jekt in 10 or Laguna in 8, insofar as I was left wanting to see more of his story and his adventure in particular. But beyond that, the great distinction of Dion being a tragic character and having a tragic story arc, which it really was, is that often in fantasy stories and Final Fantasy stories, we have characters who are tragic because of personal flaws, such as pride or hubris, and because of that they've made bad decisions that has led them down a path to ruin. So Boromir in Lord of the Rings, for example, Cypher in Final Fantasy VIII, and so on. But Dion, in a way, is more tragic because he came undone by making all of the right decisions and being a good person. So that was a really good, if brief, character arc that I quite enjoyed, as I say. Turning to Vivian, I really liked her more for gameplay and lore purposes, because while Final Fantasy games, they can become quite dense and perhaps disorientating if you step away from them for a while and then go back and forget where you are in the story and that sort of thing. Traditionally, you would have scenarios where your party is all together, such as on the Highwind airship or the Ragnarok. You can speak to someone and they will relay current events and sort of tell you where you need to go. What Final Fantasy XVI did was introduce, firstly, the active time lore button, which was great for getting immediate context in a cutscene or a scenario. But more so than that, they had Vivian, who was a really interesting character who had a bit of edge to her. And she was really good at building the world and building the setting for us in a visual, interactive way, because we could just talk to her. She would relay the history up to the current events of Valisthea. So quite a minor character, but one that gave immense meaning to the world and the setting of Final Fantasy XVI. Now, moving briefly into villains in this game, again, a great cast of three-dimensional but flawed characters. Benedicta, Barnabas, Hugo, and so on, each balanced this inherent villainy and dislikability with actually, I suppose, a certain sympathetic edge in some cases, and some more than others, certainly. So Benedicta, for example, is cast very much as a victim of circumstance, and her strongly alluded to history with Cid shows that she was never always a sort of devious bad character. And actually the sort of typical tragic fantasy character I was just talking about, she falls into that category where she's clearly fumbled down a path towards villainy. Likewise, Hugo, or I should say by contrast, Hugo Kupka is a typical sort of comic book villain whose primary asset is their physicality. And while he very much is this sort of straightforward bad guy, we enjoy to hate him. Nobody particularly likes him, which I think makes him a great, well-written villain. There was a certain edge to his character, because despite his ruthlessness, despite him being a complete bastard, he also had this forlorn feeling towards Benedicta. So again, it wasn't something that was amplified or developed to a huge degree, but it was enough to sort of give this sense that there was something more to him. And it was like, if I knew more about him, maybe I could feel sorry for him, but I don't, sort of thing. So really intriguing little hook there. And finally, Barnabas, and to a lesser extent, Sleipnir, who was his commander. And I really liked these two because they both together amplified our idea of Odin, who has always been a sort of dark, ominous summon within the Final Fantasy games. And they really brought this to life and brought along their own sense of menace and, I suppose, religious zealotry as well. Particularly Barnabas, who was very much under the thrall of Ultima's objectives. Very nihilistic and typically, I suppose, Final Fantasy villain in his characterization. And I think his final interactions with Clive offered this sense of pity, perhaps, about how removed from reality and warped he had become. And again, I'm not sure where they stand with DLC or extensions to this game, but there's so much potential in a few of these characters. Like, they hint at so much that you could uncover and a little bit more. And Barnabas and how he came to have this perspective on the world. And the fact that in his dying moments he starts talking about his mother, it's just a hook that shows there's so much more to this story and this character, and we've kind of scratched the surface of it. And finally, we have Ultima. And in summary, I think Ultima is a very interesting take on a Final Fantasy villain. And actually, perhaps we could say an amalgamation of a classic Final Fantasy villain. Because often you have human characters who aspire or otherwise end up becoming gods, like Kefka or Sephiroth. Or you have these secret, ultimate bad guy boss destroyer gods emerging unexpectedly, like Necron or like Yu Yevon, who lack characterization, but they are like these creator figures or destroyer figures. So Ultima brought these things together and came together as this obscure god character, introduced relatively early to the story, but like Sephiroth, I suppose, with a veil of mystique and unknown intentions that gradually builds up and unveils and reconciles with the other key mystery, which is how and why Clive has this status of mythos and this harbinger of the icons. So really loved how that was structured and came together. Additionally, I loved the unsettling character design and how they crafted this emotionally empty, sort of otherworldly figure that was the perfect antithesis to the vibrancy and the sort of lust for life, I suppose, that our characters are striving towards, you know, recreating the world in a better way, which was Cid's vision. And while Ultima did in its own way seek self-preservation, it was once more the very human perseverance of Clive and co., the logos, the consciousness, the humanity that contrasted beautifully and ultimately wins out the nihilistic god figure. And as mentioned, of course, it's this perfect existentialist climax and theme of the game, because while Clive is aware of the blight, and of course there's this blight spreading across the world, it's the impetus for why Ultima, is trying to get away from it as well. So there's this sort of hopelessness because the blight is going to win out eventually, which Ultima can't comprehend why humanity would want to persist and carry on living. So it's this essential kind of conflict between meaninglessness and actually creating your own meaning despite being in a finite life on a finite world. And it came together really well with that sort of bittersweetness, such as we see in Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX. So I really enjoy that Final Fantasy XVI chimed with that. Now, as mentioned, I'm going to break down some granular episodes on Final Fantasy XVI in future, but I would be remiss if I didn't finally mention the soundtrack by Masayoshi Soken, which, in my opinion, is one of the best soundtracks that we've seen in a Final Fantasy game. And although I was dubious about whether anyone could live up and top the Final Fantasy XV's excellent score by Yoko Shimomura, Soken really struck a beautiful balance here of both nostalgia and cultural nods to the Final Fantasy scores of days gone by, with a unique and contextually based soundtrack that chimed with both the setting, but also unique in-game scenarios that resulted in something quite spectacular, actually. And for example, there's several types of battle score, depending on the type of enemy, or indeed the narrative circumstance. There's several character themes, town themes, and moods that relate to both setting and scenario. And I really feel that the entire soundtrack was considered along narrative lines, contextual lines, resulting in something really, really good. So there we have it. That's my belated initial review of Final Fantasy XVI. I did mean to get this out much earlier, but I got there in the end, and I would love to hear other people's experiences and opinions on it, because I think there was a lot of build-up, there was a lot of divisiveness, and a lot of speculation about how this game would land, how it would chime with different demographics and subdivisions of existing Final Fantasy fans, and of course new Final Fantasy fans. But for me personally, as a long-time fan of the series, as someone that's really invested in the series, I think it really returned to focus on telling a deep, considered, involved story, self-contained story. It had deep character interactions, deep character development, and it was a story that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It didn't expect and kind of propose to rely on extended multimedia material. It didn't propose it was going to need DLC to sort of fill in gaps or anything like that. And I'm not to discredit any previous games. And to that end, I think it really delivered. And I don't even need to say it did that at the expense of gameplay or at the expense of any other aspect of game design, mechanic, or even music, because I think all of this stuff was fantastic. You know, it was different, but it was different in a way that, as I've explained here, I think still retained the sense of Final Fantasy in a very strong way. But again, that's my opinion, and I know some people have been divided to that end. So ultimately, if you got this far, thanks very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And feel free to drop a comment below letting me know your thoughts on Final Fantasy XVI.